You have felt this, the specific shift that arrives within seconds of stepping outside on a windy day. An alertness, a presence, a sense of inhabiting your body more fully than you did 30 seconds earlier when you were indoors. The mental chatter recedes, the awareness sharpens. The body feels more real, more present, more occupied. You attributed it to fresh air, or to the cold, or to the pleasure of being outside. The mechanism is more specific than any of those explanations, and more physical. The mechanism is the full surface activation of a sensory system that indoor living has reduced to a fraction of its designed capacity. No indoor environment activates the mechanoreceptors across your entire skin surface simultaneously. A room cannot do it. The air is still, the temperature is uniform, the pressure on every square centimeter of skin is identical from hour to hour. A shower activates skin unevenly. Water hits the front or the back. The stimulus is thermal rather than mechanical, the coverage is partial, and the pattern is predictable. Clothing dampens the signal. Fabric sits against the skin with constant, unchanging pressure that the mechanoreceptors habituate to within minutes and stop reporting. The receptors are still there. The nerve endings are intact. The cortical processing regions are allocated and waiting. But the input is so constant, so uniform, so unchanging, that the system has nothing to process. Your skin contains approximately 5 million mechanoreceptors distributed across 1.7 square meters of surface area, and indoors, in still air, under clothing, the vast majority of them have nothing to report. They are sensors without a signal. Wind changes this. Wind is the only common stimulus that reaches every exposed square centimeter of skin at once. Varying in pressure, varying in direction, varying in temperature, varying in intensity from moment to moment as gusts arrive and pass and return at different angles. Every mechanoreceptor type fires simultaneously in constantly varying patterns that no indoor environment produces. The somatosensory cortex receives full body input at a bandwidth no indoor experience provides. The aliveness is not poetry, and it is not imagination. It is your cortex operating at maximum sensory input for the first time all day, processing data from 5 million sensors that have been sitting idle in the still air of the indoor world. The cortex receives the signal it was designed to process. The signal displaces the rumination that was running in the signal's absence. The aliveness is not metaphorical. It is cortical. Your skin detects wind through a different receptor profile than the one the soil discussion described for the hands. Soil activates all 4 classical mechanoreceptor types: Meissner for texture, Merkel for sustained form, Pacinian for deep vibration, Ruffini for stretch. Wind activates a different array. Pacinian corpuscles, which respond to deep vibration transmitted through solid objects, contribute little to wind detection because wind is a surface phenomenon. Merkel cells, which respond to sustained indentation from pressing against an object, contribute little because wind does not indent the skin. The wind-specific array is Meissner for flutter, Ruffini for sustained pressure, free nerve endings for temperature, and hair follicle receptors for directional deflection. 4 receptor types operating simultaneously, and understanding what each contributes explains why wind feels qualitatively different from every other sensory experience the indoor world offers. Meissner corpuscles in the superficial dermis detect light, touch, and flutter at 10 to 50 Hz. The oscillating pressure variations as wind gusts and ebbs across exposed skin. These are the receptors that detect texture when you run your fingers across a surface. The fine-grained flutter that distinguishes silk from cotton, smooth from rough, dry from damp. In wind, they detect the texture of the air itself, the pressure fluctuations that distinguish a steady breeze from a gusty wind, the turbulence patterns the atmosphere produces as it flows around buildings and trees and your own body. Meissner corpuscles are most dense in the fingertips and the face, the regions most commonly exposed to wind. Your face in wind is receiving Meissner input across its entire surface simultaneously, detecting pressure variations at frequencies and amplitudes that no indoor air current replicates. An air conditioning vent produces a steady, unvarying flow. Wind produces a turbulent, constantly shifting flow that the Meissner corpuscles report as a continuous stream of novel data. Data that never repeats because the atmosphere never produces an identical turbulence pattern twice. Think about the hair. Because every vellus hair on your body, the fine short hairs covering your arms, neck, face, and torso, is a mechanical antenna the wind activates. And the antenna system is more sensitive and more information-rich than the skin surface beneath it. Hair follicle receptors are nerve endings wrapped around the root of every vellus hair. The hair shaft protrudes from the follicle at an angle, tilted, not vertical. Wind deflects it. The deflection stimulates the nerve ending at the hair root, encoding wind speed by the magnitude of deflection, wind direction by the direction of deflection, and wind variability by the frequency of deflection change. A single forearm exposed to wind contains tens of thousands of these antennae, each one providing independent directional data to the somatosensory cortex. Each hair is a lever arm that amplifies the force of moving air, force too small to stimulate the skin's pressure receptors directly, into a neural signal at the follicle base. The amplification is mechanical. The hair shaft acts as a lever with the fulcrum at the skin surface, converting a small distributed force across the hair's length into a concentrated force at the follicle root where the nerve ending wraps. This is the mechanism behind the sensation people describe as feeling the wind on your skin. The primary detector is not the skin surface, it is the hair. Shaved or hairless skin detects wind through mechanoreceptors alone. Pressure and temperature changes at the skin surface. Air-bearing skin detects wind through pressure, temperature, and directional deflection of thousands of independent antennae, each one reporting independently, each one encoding the wind conditions at its specific location on the body surface. The signal is richer. The cortex receives more data per square centimeter. The subjective experience is more vivid, which is why the wind on your face and forearms, where vellus hair is dense and fine, feels more alive than the wind on your palm, which has no vellus hair and detects wind through pressure alone. The difference in vividness between hairy and hairless skin in wind is the difference between a single microphone and an array of thousands. Both detect sound, but the array provides spatial resolution the single microphone cannot. That mechanism, every vellus hair an independent directional antenna, tens of thousands of them per limb, amplifying a force too small for the skin's pressure receptors to detect directly, is the detail that made the cutaneous physiology literature feel like it was describing an antenna array rather than a skin surface. Ruffini endings in the deeper dermis detect sustained stretch and pressure, the continuous force of steady wind against the skin surface, the sustained push that remains constant between gusts. These are the receptors that tell the somatosensory cortex whether the wind is pushing from the left or the right, whether the force is steady or varying, whether the air mass is moving consistently or turbulently. The Meissner corpuscles detect the flutter, the rapid variations. The Ruffini endings detect the baseline, the steady state beneath the variations. Together they encode the full temporal profile of the wind, its variability and its persistence, its gusts and its steady state, its moment-to-moment character and its sustained direction. The encoding is simultaneous. Both receptor types reporting continuously, the cortex integrating both streams into a single percept of wind that includes both the fluctuations and the constant. Free nerve endings respond to the temperature of the moving air. TRPM8 channels activating in cool wind below approximately 25 degrees, TRPV4 channels activating in warm wind above approximately 34 degrees. The temperature signal is not redundant with the mechanical signal. It is a separate data stream that tells the somatosensory cortex not just that wind is present, but what the wind carries. Cool air arriving from the north, warm air rising from sun-heated pavement. The sudden temperature drop as a cloud shadow passes. The thermal gradient between the windward side of the face, which receives the air mass directly, and the leeward side, which sits in the wake. Each free nerve ending reports the local temperature at its specific position on the skin, producing a thermal map of the wind that varies across the body surface and changes with each shift in wind direction. 4 receptor types, 4 independent data streams, all reporting simultaneously from every exposed square centimeter. No indoor environment produces this combination. No indoor air current activates all 4 types simultaneously because indoor air movement is too slow for Meissner flutter detection, too constant for Ruffini variation encoding, too thermally uniform for temperature mapping, and too weak for Vellus hair deflection. Wind activates all 4 because wind is the stimulus the receptor array evolved to detect. The match between stimulus and sensor is not coincidental. It is the product of 2 million years of calibration in an environment where air moved. Now, what happens in the cortex when all 4 receptor types fire simultaneously across the full body surface? Because the somatosensory cortex maintains a topographic map of the entire body, and wind activates the entire map at once, producing a computational demand the indoor environment never approaches. Somatosensory cortex, the strip of neural tissue running across the top of the brain from ear to ear, contains a point-by-point representation of the body surface. Each body part has a dedicated processing region, the cortical homunculus, with its grotesquely enlarged hands and face reflecting the disproportionate neural resources allocated to the most densely innervated body parts. During normal indoor activity, a small fraction of this map is active at any given moment. The hands during typing, the feet during walking, the face during eating. Large areas of the body map receive minimal input because the skin on the torso, the arms, and the legs is covered by clothing and receiving constant, unchanging pressure that the receptors have long since habituated to and stopped reporting. The cortical regions dedicated to these body parts are quiet, allocated, but unused. The processing resources they would normally consume are available for other functions. The default mode network, the self-referential rumination system, expands into those freed resources the way water fills an empty channel. Entire map activates simultaneously in wind. Face, neck, arms, hands, legs if exposed. All body regions send variable input to their corresponding cortical areas at once. The somatosensory cortex transitions from partial activation to full surface activation, from a map with a few lit regions and large dark zones, to a map that is illuminated across its entire extent. The processing demand increases dramatically. The cortex must process variable sensory data from every represented body part simultaneously rather than sequentially. The resources the default mode network was occupying are reclaimed by the somatosensory system because incoming environmental data has processing priority. The cortex processes current sensory input before it processes self-generated narrative. The cortex does not choose between the wind data and the rumination. The wind data arrives first and takes the resources. Consequence is cortical competition. The soil discussion described this mechanism for the hands. 17,000 mechanoreceptors per hand, 4 receptor types, cortical resource competition displacing rumination. Wind extends the principle from the hands to the entire body surface. 5 million receptors rather than 34,000, the full cortical map rather than the hand regions alone. The scale is different. The mechanism is identical. The default mode network, rumination, worry, planning, regret, self-referential processing, cannot maintain its activity while the somatosensory cortex is demanding full surface processing resources from every body region simultaneously. The mental clarity people describe in wind is the default mode network losing a competition for cortical bandwidth to a sensory input. It cannot ignore because the input is arriving from the entire skin surface at once. Wind does not calm the mind through any psychological mechanism. It does not require the person to be mindful, to focus on the breath, to adopt a particular mental posture. It overwhelms the cortex with legitimate sensory data that displaces the self-referential processing running in the absence of competing input. The indoor world provides so little sensory variation that the default mode network runs unchallenged for hours. Wind provides so much variation that the default mode network cannot sustain itself for seconds. The difference is not effort. The difference is input. You see, and the respiratory system responds independently of the skin, because wind directly into the face produces a breathing effect that no indoor environment replicates, and the effect operates through the physics of pressure resistance rather than through any conscious breathing technique. Facing into wind increases inspiratory resistance. The air pressure against the nostrils and mouth creates a slight positive pressure that the respiratory muscles must overcome to inhale. The resistance is small, a few centimeters of water pressure at moderate wind speeds, barely perceptible as a conscious sensation, but it is sufficient to recruit the diaphragm more fully than calm air breathing requires. In still indoor air, tidal breathing, the shallow automatic breathing that sustains resting metabolism, uses a fraction of the diaphragm's contractile capacity. The diaphragm contracts just enough to create the small negative pressure differential that draws air in. Against wind resistance, the diaphragm must contract more forcefully. Each breath requires more muscular effort. Tidal volume increases slightly. Each breath draws more air because the respiratory muscles are working harder to pull it in. Deeper breath activates stretch receptors in the lung. Parenchyma, the herring. Breuer reflex, which modulates respiratory rate, typically slowing it. The lungs stretch further. The stretch receptors fire. The brainstem receives the signal that the lungs are more inflated than usual and delays the next inspiratory command. The breath cycle lengthens. The respiratory rate drops. The pattern shifts from shallow and fast to deep and slow, the parasympathetic dominant breathing pattern that the psi discussion identified as producing vagal activation through the baroreceptor reflex. Combination. Deeper breaths at a slower rate against mild resistance is the respiratory pattern that clinical breathing devices attempt to produce artificially. Inspiratory muscle trainers, devices that create a calibrated resistance at specific pressures, are prescribed for respiratory rehabilitation, COPD management, and respiratory muscle strengthening in older adults. Wind provides a form of inspiratory resistance naturally, uncalibrated, variable, and lower than the prescribed pressures clinical devices deliver. Whether the accumulated effect of regular wind exposure produces respiratory muscle adaptation comparable to prescribed training has not been directly measured. The resistance is present. The equivalence to clinical protocols is not established. What is established, the breathing pattern shifts toward deeper, slower cycles against the resistance, and the deeper, slower, parasympathetic dominant pattern is what every breathing protocol in the series has described from a different angle. Well, and the thermal physics, because wind changes the temperature your body experiences through a mechanism that operates independently of the actual air temperature. And the change is large enough to activate a stress response pathway the body benefits from. Wind increases the rate of evaporative heat loss from exposed skin. Sweat evaporation. Even the imperceptible perspiration the skin produces continuously, the insensible water loss that occurs through the stratum corneum without visible sweating, is accelerated by moving air. In still air, a thin boundary layer of moisture-saturated air forms above the skin's surface. This boundary layer acts as an insulating blanket. It slows further evaporation because the air directly above the skin is already holding as much moisture as it can accept. Wind strips this boundary layer away and replaces it with drier air that accepts more moisture. Evaporation accelerates. Each gram of sweat that evaporates absorbs approximately 2,260 joules of thermal energy from the skin surface. The skin cools. The cooling is measurable. Exposed skin temperature drops within seconds of wind contact, and the drop continues for the duration of the exposure as the boundary layer is continuously removed and reformed and removed again. TRPM8 cold receptors activate more broadly across the exposed surface, not the focal activation of touching a cold object, but the distributed activation of the entire exposed skin surface cooling simultaneously. Sympathetic nervous system registers this cooling as a mild cold stress, producing a small norepinephrine release that enhances alertness, improves mood, and primes immune cell activity through the hormetic pathway the cold thermogenesis discussion described. The wind chill effect, the sensation that moving air feels colder than still air at an identical temperature, is the physics of enhanced evaporative and convective heat loss expressed as a felt temperature. Your body responds to wind, not at the actual air temperature, but at the effective temperature the evaporative cooling produces, which can be 5 to 10 degrees Celsius lower than the still air reading. Cold stress is mild, diffuse, and sustained across the duration of the wind exposure, exactly the hormetic profile that produces beneficial adaptation without tissue damage. Brief enough to trigger the norepinephrine release, not severe enough to produce hypothermic risk in a person wearing appropriate clothing. The wind is providing the stress response pathway. The cold shower activates at a gentler intensity over a broader body surface without the shock. The person who walks in wind for 20 minutes receives a sustained, mild, whole-body cold stimulus that the indoor environment, maintained at thermoneutral 20 to 22 degrees, never provides. And then, the vestibular contribution. Because strong wind produces a mechanical force on the body that the balance system must respond to, and the response is a training stimulus the indoor environment has entirely eliminated. Sustained or gusting wind produces a lateral force on the body that the vestibular system must counteract to maintain upright posture. The otolith organs, the utricle and sacral in the inner ear, detect the lateral acceleration the wind imparts to the head. The semicircular canals detect the corrective head movements the body produces to maintain visual stability while the wind pushes the head off its resting position. The cerebellum integrates the wind force data with proprioceptive input from the ankles, knees, hips, and trunk musculature to generate continuous postural adjustments that vary in magnitude and direction with each gust, that cannot be predicted and must be computed in real time, that demand the cerebellar processing resources that a flat, still indoor environment leaves idle. Standing in wind is a dynamic balance challenge, the category of variable, unpredictable loading that the dirt walking discussion described for the feet, applied here to the entire postural control system through an external force the person did not generate and cannot predict. Each gust produces a different lateral force. Each lull produces a different recovery demand. The postural muscles engage and release in patterns the cerebellum must compute, gust by gust. The processing is automatic. The person does not choose to balance. The cerebellum handles it below awareness. But the computational demand is real and the training effect accumulates. Consider the person over 65 who stands in wind and feels slightly unsteady, who reaches for a railing, who braces against a wall, who turns their back to reduce the force. The unsteadiness is not weakness, and it is not frailty. It is the balance system encountering a lateral force demand it has not been trained for. Because indoor environments, with their still air, flat floors, and predictable surfaces, eliminate the unpredictable lateral forces that wind provides. The vestibular cerebellar calibration that degrades with age degrades partly because the training stimuli that maintained it have been removed from the daily sensory environment. The wobble in wind is not a sign that the person should avoid wind. It is a sign that the balance system is receiving input it needs, input that will improve the calibration with repeated exposure. The principle, use-dependent maintenance of balance circuits through variable loading, is established for ground surface variability in the balance literature. The specific application to wind-induced lateral perturbation as a vestibular training stimulus is this discussion's inference from that principle. The training begins with the first gust and accumulates with each subsequent windy walk. The use-dependent maintenance, the entropy discussion described for bone under mechanical load, applied here to the neural circuits that maintain upright posture against unpredictable perturbation. That convergence, full surface mechanoreceptor activation suppressing the default mode network, respiratory resistance deepening the breathing pattern toward parasympathetic dominance, evaporative cooling triggering a mild hormetic norepinephrine release, and vestibular loading training the balance system through unpredictable lateral force, is the finding that made wind stop being weather for me and start being a sensory environment the indoor world has eliminated. 4 independent mechanisms operating through 4 different anatomical pathways during a single experience of standing in moving air. Skin, lungs, thermoregulation, and balance, each receiving a stimulus the indoor world does not provide, each producing a measurable physiological response, each contributing to the integrated experience the person describes as feeling alive. And here is what matters about the integration. The person does not experience 4 separate mechanisms. The person experiences one feeling: aliveness, presence, clarity, engagement. The 4 mechanisms produce one integrated state because the body processes them simultaneously, not sequentially. The cortical competition, the deeper breathing, the norepinephrine release, and the balance engagement arrive together within the first 30 seconds of wind exposure. The person feels a single shift from the dull, muted, understimulated state of indoor existence to the sharp, vivid, fully activated state of standing in moving air. The shift feels instantaneous because the mechanisms are instantaneous. Wind activates all 4 pathways with the first gust. The body responds as a single system because it is a single system, and the wind is the input the system was designed to receive. And then, consider what the indoor world provides by comparison. Because the contrast is what makes the wind's effect so immediate, indoor world is still. The air does not move. The skin habituates to clothing pressure and stops reporting. The somatosensory cortex goes quiet across most of the body map. The regions dedicated to the torso, the arms, the legs receiving no variable input, no novel data, no signal that differs from the signal they received an hour ago. The default mode network runs unchallenged because no competing sensory input displaces it. The respiratory muscles breathe against no resistance. Each inhalation meets still air that offers no opposition, the diaphragm contracting at its minimum effective force. The respiratory muscles never ask to work at the capacity they possess. The vestibular system encounters no lateral force. The person stands and sits and walks in still air, the otolith organs reporting nothing that requires cerebellar computation, the postural muscles never challenged by an unpredictable perturbation. The thermoregulatory system detects no evaporative challenge. The room is maintained at thermoneutral temperature. The boundary layer sits undisturbed on the skin surface. The TRPM8 receptors have nothing to report. 5 million mechanoreceptors with nothing to report. A somatosensory cortex running at a fraction of its design capacity. A respiratory system never asked to work against resistance. A balanced system never challenged by an unpredictable force. A thermoregulatory system maintained in artificial thermal neutrality. The indoor world is sensory deprivation for the skin, and the body that has spent 8 hours in it has been running every system at reduced input, every cortical map at reduced activation, every sensor at reduced demand. The body is not resting. It is understimulated, and the understimulation is not neutral. It is the condition that allows the default mode network to dominate, the respiratory pattern to shallow, the balance calibration to degrade, and the thermoregulatory system to atrophy. Stillness is not rest. It is the absence of the input the body was designed to receive. Now, 2 minutes outside in wind reverses every deficit simultaneously. The mechanoreceptors activate. 5 million sensors that were idle in the still indoor air begin firing as the wind reaches each exposed square centimeter. The cortex receives full surface data. The somatosensory map lights up from partial activation to full surface activation within the first gust. The default mode network loses the competition. The self-referential loop that sustained the rumination for hours indoors is displaced within seconds by the volume of incoming sensory data. The diaphragm works against resistance. Each inhalation against the wind recruits the diaphragm more fully, increasing tidal volume, slowing respiratory rate. The skin cools. The boundary layer is stripped, evaporation accelerates, TRPM8 receptors fire across the exposed surface, norepinephrine releases into the bloodstream. The vestibular system processes lateral force, the otolith organs detect the push, the cerebellum computes the postural adjustments, The balance muscles engage and release with each gust. The sequence unfolds within the first minutes of exposure. The mechanoreceptors activate immediately with the first gust. The respiratory pattern shifts within the first several breath cycles. The norepinephrine release follows the thermal stimulus by a minute or two. The vestibular engagement is continuous from the first perturbation. Within a few minutes of standing in wind, every system described in this discussion has received its input. The somatosensory cortex is processing full-body data. The respiratory pattern has deepened and slowed. The norepinephrine is circulating. The balance system is computing. The default mode network is suppressed. The body is operating at a bandwidth it has not accessed since the last time the person stood in moving air, which, for many people over 65 who spend most of their time indoors, may have been days or weeks ago. And here is what 2 minutes looks like. Face into the wind. Arms slightly away from the body to expose more skin surface to moving air. Eyes open. Allow the vellus hairs to detect the direction. Allow the Meissner corpuscles to report the flutter. Allow the Ruffini endings to register the sustained pressure. Allow the free nerve endings to report the temperature of the air mass crossing your skin. Allow the diaphragm to work against the resistance the inhalation provides. Allow the vestibular system to process the lateral force and compute the postural adjustments it has not been asked to compute indoors. The wind is not weather to endure. It is a sensory stimulus to receive. The most complete full-body activation. Your mechanoreceptor array encounters in any ordinary day. Your skin has been waiting for it. 5 million senses. 1.7 square meters of surface area, built across 2 million years for an environment where air moves, where gusts arrive and pass, where the skin receives variable mechanical input from every direction simultaneously. The indoor world provides none of it. 8 hours indoors is 8 hours of sensory deprivation for the largest organ in your body, the organ with 5 million senses and 1.7 square meters of surface area running at idle. The wind arrives and every sensor fires. The cortex floods. The rumination stops. The breathing deepens. The balance recalibrates. The norepinephrine releases. The body wakes up, not metaphorically, not poetically, but neurologically. Every system activates, every map illuminates, every receptor reports. The body that walks back inside after 2 minutes in wind is physiologically different from the body that walked out, not because the wind fixed anything, but because the wind provided the input that every system was designed to receive and that the indoor world has entirely withheld.